That is a very general overview of the background in Christian practice and teaching regarding the matter of slavery. It's in this context that in the late 17th century, these two Capuchin missionaries began their project of attacking, critiquing, doing whatever they could to fight the practice of slavery in Cuba, where they found themselves after being deported from what is now Venezuela and Colombia. What they decided to do was this. Since they were dealing with the Spanish representatives in the civil government who weren't going to change the system, and since the system was becoming more and more entrenched in the early Cuban economy at that time, especially in terms of what we would call small farms, raising tobacco and crops like that, it hadn't yet become the big institutionalized slavery production system of Cuba, which was typical of the 19th century. This was earlier, but it was the beginning of that whole development. Since they were in a political and economic situation where they had little power, they decided to use what power they did have as churchmen. And so they started giving homilies at their masses against the practice and the institution itself of slavery. I make that distinction between practice and institution for a reason, because they are two different kinds of things. In the practice of slavery, you can have a kind of abusive treatment of slaves by the slaves' owner themselves on the plantations. So you can have harsh penalties to keep control of the slaves. You can have harsh practices limiting even the little freedom that the slaves had. You even have examples of slave owners killing their slaves for whatever reason and getting away with it. Now, these are abuses, and many people recognize the immorality of these kinds of practices. And a number of people spoke up against the abuses as going too far, but not really challenging the system. On the other hand, the question of the very institution of slavery, what today in the language we're tending to use would be the structure of our political and economic order, of which slavery was a major part in Cuba in the late 17th century, that was a question which was especially bothersome because it challenged the political base and especially the economic base of the colonial system. So the odds were really not in favor of these two missionaries. But as I said, they decided to do what they could as churchmen. Besides giving homilies, they took the matter to the confessional. Now, the slave owners themselves, usually men, were not a most practicing lot. They might be baptized, they might be believers, but they weren't necessarily a church-going kind of group. But their wives were. And so when the wives came to confession to these two priests, Epifanio and Francisco Jose, the Capuchin missionaries, the Capuchin missionaries said, "Unless you free your slaves, I will not give you absolution." landowners themselves, they should be the husbands of the wives, were particularly concerned about whether or not they received absolution in confession, because they were not known for practicing their faith. But their wives were involved in church work, and so they complained to their husbands. The husbands, in turn, decided that what the missionaries were doing was something important enough to complain to the civil authorities. And so what started out as a matter of religious practice with the wives turned into a social problem, because the civil authorities began to understand that this could have ramifications. For instance, talk about freeing slaves could inspire a slave revolt. The civil authorities went to the church authorities. At that time, there was only one bishop in all of Cuba, because there was only one diocese. The bishop at that time resided in Santiago de Cuba, the southeastern part of the island. The church authorities, you have to remember that the church and state were closely connected in those days, acted by excommunicating the missionaries and trying to silence them in that way. But the missionaries were not about to go along with even actions by church authorities. They claimed that they were really not under the jurisdiction of the local diocese of Cuba, of the bishop in Santiago. They were really under the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith in the Vatican, which was the evangelizing office at that time. And so they appealed their excommunication to Rome. However, we have to remember in those days, communications were very different from what they are today. And these written appeals or verdicts took months to cross the Atlantic and arrive at the proper offices. And then you had the return voyages to bring the answers back. So everything was on hold, at least in terms of the determination of the rights of the different parties according to church law. Because a number of people were bothered by what they had seen in the practice of slavery, the way slaves were treated, and also even perhaps in the very institution of slavery. As things developed, the two missionaries decided to write in detail a defense of what they were doing, explaining the rationale for their procedure. In doing so, they produced two documents. Now, these were not published as books the way we would have today. These were handwritten manuscripts, and they were written for different objectives. The one that was written by Francisco Jose, who was the Spaniard from Aragon, was written in Spanish, and it was mainly a biblical analysis of slavery and an argument against people who tried to justify slavery from the Bible. We have to remember, of course, that in the Bible there is mention of slavery, and there is not a critique of slavery in itself. And it happened to be the practice of the time when the different parts of the Bible were written. And so some people use that to project forward to the 17th century and say, well, if it's good enough for people in biblical times, well, what's the problem with us having slaves ourselves? The second manuscript, written in Latin instead of in Spanish, was by Epifanio de Moana, and it is the subject of the book that I referred to that I wrote in 2007. This document was different from Francisco José's in the sense that it was written for a different audience. Because it was written in Latin, which common people did not understand, it was aimed more at church authorities who understood Latin, of course, and even for a theological audience and an academic audience, because Latin was really the language of the universities in Europe. Epifanio's manuscript used categories that went beyond the Bible and applying what the Bible says to slavery. It brought in that part of the church's tradition which we call natural law. This was a type of moral language which attempted to explain the common sense moral applications in church teaching to people who weren't necessarily believers, part of the church, who didn't necessarily accept the Bible as an authoritative search. And so that kind of language had the potentiality of reaching a wider audience, as well as impressing church authorities more, because it was also, along with scriptural studies, a part of the Catholic tradition. Both of these documents took aim at the practice of slavery, the way these missionaries saw it being put into practice on the plantations in Cuba, what they had also seen in Cumaná, in modern-day Venezuela for Epifanio, or in Cartagena, modern-day Colombia, by Francisco José. But also it attacked the institution of slavery, namely the very system itself, which is something that we would refer to as the way our societies are set up, our very structure of society, or you might even say our culture, which of course was much more important and much deeper than just saying a particular kind of abuse. They presented these documents in their own defense. And it appears that church authorities in Havana, maybe members of their own religious orders or local diocesan clergy, went through these documents, especially in terms of Epifanio's document written in Latin. Somebody made, or it could be a group of people, not just necessarily one, made notes in the margins of his manuscript, trying in a small way to argue back and forth with him, or making comments. So we can see at least somebody was taking it seriously enough to deal with it. The trial was arranged in Havana, and it was presided over by a member of the church authority, a representative of the bishop, called a vicar. And that member, the way the trial was set up, that vicar, that member of the court appointed by the bishop, was both the prosecutor and the judge. Now, the way the trial proceeded was this. The beginning of the procedure was a presentation of the evidence against the two missionaries. This was done by people who had heard about what the priests had been doing in confession, denying absolution to the penitent. All these people, of course, who were putting forth complaints against the missionaries were third parties. These were not the wives themselves or the landowners themselves that were involved firsthand in the procedure, in the denial of absolution, but people who had heard about it. And so the evidence, even in that time, wasn't all that strong. Anyway, after all these complaints had been lodged against the missionaries, it was the missionaries' time to defend themselves. And the court asked the missionaries to respond. They remained silent. They refused to say anything in their own defense. Now, we have to stop here and ask a question and provide a little context for why this might be. It could be that they were imitating the story of the passion of Jesus before Pilate, when Jesus was accused of various wrongdoings by people. And when asked about them by Pilate, he said nothing. So it could be that they were going through, and in their own way, by not saying anything, indicating that they were suffering what Jesus went through. However, it could be a more complicated kind of answer, because in the Catholic tradition, sacrament of penance is a confidential kind of conversation between the penitent and the confessor. And as a sacrament, this confidentiality is taken most seriously. In fact, in an absolute sense. The rule is, by the way, the rule is called the seal of confession. The rule is that the confessor, the priest, is not supposed to say absolutely anything about what occurs in confession. And this is mostly understood in the strictest absolute sense. So even to admit that a confession occurred was something that was not admissible. And so notice the bind the priests were in. If they opened their mouths and started saying, well, I didn't say that, they're equivalently admitting that a confession occurred. And if they tried to specifically deny the kinds of charges they had made or justify them, they would be equivalently revealing confessional matter and violating that rule against breaking the seal of confession according to canon law, church law. Now, it could be one or the other, or even both of these reasons that inspired the missionaries to keep silent. We simply don't know. As we might predict, the trial did not go in favor of the missionaries. They were convicted of disturbing the public order, speaking with acrimony about customs in the society at that time, and they were convicted and sentenced to being deported back to Spain when the first ship sailing for Spain arrived in the port of Havana. In the meantime, they had to spend the time in prison, not house arrest by now, but in prison. It was in this time that they finished off their manuscripts and put them in the condition that we find them in the Archivo General de Indias, which is the local collection of all colonial documents from the Spanish colonies during the colonial years. That collection is housed in Seville, Spain, and the documents are available there. The only copies of the original manuscripts that exist. Eventually, a ship came, and the missionaries were put on the ship and sent back to Spain, where they were placed under house arrest as missionaries who had failed in their task to serve the church and the people in the colonies. We might ask ourselves, wait a minute, what happened to the initial support that had happened before this trial? Well, unfortunately, a lot of that fell away once the authorities started going after the missionaries. Backed away from supporting them because these people were afraid of the authorities.